I'm going to be working on the chipping now. Now what I've got in my palette is this original mix colors. It's in a bottle labeled buff, but it's just a mix of colors that I used for this brown. I put in some of the Tamiya paint retarder and some X28 thinner. Normally I wouldn't use Tamiya paints for chipping, but I wanted to match this color for a particular reason. I want this dark gray to look as though it's overpainted over the tan. So by using the tan color, I can introduce some chipping and it will look just right, hopefully. I'm probably going to chip this area, this darker gray area, fairly heavy, just so that it, helps sell the notion of a field applied paint that's not really the most durable stuff. So this I may go to town on the chipping on this part of it. All right, well, I'm going to call that part of it done. I realized that the brush chipping just wasn't doing what I wanted, so I went for a sponge. And I didn't think these Tamiya acrylics would sponge very well, but I figured out the touch that seemed to get them to work. Then I went back with the brush and just did some scratches and other stuff like that because I wanted this dark color to really look scratched up. Now I put a little bit of the tan over the decals. I should have gone into the decals first and put the dark color over it and then gone in and put in some of the tan, but what I decided to do is just go ahead and continue chipping over the decals with the tan color, and then those will be the mappings for where I put my dark color. So some of the stuff I'll paint in completely. Some of it I'll paint the black around the tan and just kind of work that in and go with that. All right, while I wait on that tan color to dry, I'm going to use some Maschinen green to begin the lighter chipping tones on this green area, this little hatch here. I'm going to try and be careful and not get it over onto the other color. But if I do, I'll just go back in later and add in some more chipping. This Maschinen green seems to be a very good universal color for lighter chipping of anything that looks olive or that, a darker kind of green. I've used it in a lot of situations and I just really like it. It's one of those paints that I tend to keep around. It's a bit of a schmoo. I put it on here and it looks a little brighter. It works. It looks a little brighter. I've used it to completely paint a model. If you remember that little Macatro Wego thing that I did back sometime around last Christmas, it seems, or prior to that. Just a little silly mecha. I painted it in that, and when you paint an entire model with it, it tends to take on a little bit of a more desaturated look for some reason. So it's a very versatile paint. I like using it. But I'll do this just with the brush, and then on the foot here that I also painted green, I'm going to do sponging and brush chipping. I'm going to heavily chip that thing. For the light colored chipping, I'm going to use this Iraqi sand. I tried some others, wasn't in some other mixes, deck tan and some others, and I tried them straight out of the bottle and mixes, but I came back to this Iraqi sand and I really like the way it looks. Now what I've done is I've thinned it fairly heavily with water, probably a little more than 50-50. What I did was I kind of experimented with it, is I wanted it to be thin enough that I can get very fine chips that are somewhat transparent. I don't want it at full opacity, but I want them to show up. So I thinned it down to the point where they really weren't showing. But that was sort of kind of by design. And then I just added some paint back in to my dilution to get it to where it looks like it does now. So it's a very low contrast look, but because I'm going to be putting a lot of chips on here, because I'm imagining this is in a desert environment. So there's going to be sandstorms, there's going to be, things like that. And remember, this is a post-nuclear world, so if you've ever watched any post-nuclear movies, you know that there's always sand blowing around. So I wanted just to make sure that it appeared scratchy. So plus, when you have lower contrast, lower opacity chips, I feel like you can get away with more than you would if it were a brighter, more contrasty color or more opaque, because it's just not so severe looking. This will not jump out as much as if I would have used full-on, unthinned paint or a brighter, more contrasty paint. And it gives, when it dries, you have to do some testing and evaluate how does this look when it dries, because acrylics go on usually with a little bit more punch to them and a bit more opacity generally than they dry with. Some colors that's not true, but by putting some on, and I did that earlier testing. I actually tested on this foot here, just several different combinations, because I knew I could go back easily and just add a little bit of this over and it would make it look natural. All I'm doing off camera is just dabbing this off on a paper towel. But you see, I'm just kind of building this up in layers. And where I want there to be heavier chipping, I go back and I do it a second or even a third time to build up that opacity so that it gives me the look that I want. And by the time I go and do a few other things, I can come back, evaluate that, and it'll be dry and I can decide if that looks like I want. So now I just got to do this around the rest of the model. One construction note: whenever I'm building these Maschinen Krieger kits, I don't glue on the knee armor until the end. And you can see you can see the primer still there, but this completely covers it up. But this will allow me to chip that knee armor very easily with a sponge and not have to go back in with a paintbrush or anything like that. And then at the end, I can just pop this back on there. And it's solid enough that I could leave it without gluing it. And I will probably glue it because, as with anything else I do, I'm going to try and sell this. And so I wouldn't want it falling off in transit or once it gets to somebody's house. But leaving that knee armor off has been something that I've done on most of my builds after the first few, and I figured out that worked really nicely. All right, as you can see, I'm knee deep in. Wait a minute. Probably help if I clipped this on, wouldn't it? Okay, that's better. You don't know how many times I do that. I get up, go get a cup of coffee, set my microphone down over here just off camera, and because it's hidden by the camera, my phone essentially, hanging up on a stand, I sit down and I start talking, and it's just sitting over here and I don't notice it until later. Thankfully I noticed it this time. Anyway, I've got the light colored chips applied with a sponge all over the pieces, and now what I want to do is just go in with a brush. Same mix, same watered down kind of mix, but I'm just going to add in some scratches and other things like that, just to sell that notion a little more, and just put these all around the suit. Now, I've heard some folks say that your scratches should only go in one direction, But I've never thought that, because life doesn't happen in one direction, and weathering certainly doesn't. You know, if it's walking through stuff, of course it's gonna get some damage from particular directions, but things will fall on it. Things will, you know, if you've ever been in the military and you've gone out in the woods and you've what we call breaking brush, meaning you're walking through some pretty rough terrain, you know that stuff can slap against you at a lot of different angles. So just putting a variety of scratches when you're on camera is usually, I think, the best course of action. But of course, it's your model. You do what you want to tell the story of your kit. Earlier I'd mentioned that I forgot to do some chipping on the decals so that some of the black would shine through. What I'm going to do here is just use the blade of my knife, and I'm putting a little bit of pressure, but what I'm doing is I'm just scraping through that decal down to the black surface below. Now, the reason I'm able to do this with some relative ease, like that chunk right there, that's perfect, is because these decals went down, you know, over that textured surface. It actually leaves lots of little bubbles under there. So all I'm doing is taking advantage of letting the knife discover where the bubbles are, where the places where it doesn't conform to the surface perfectly. Now, if you scrape too hard and you scrape down to the lower level of paint, that's fine. That's realistic. If you go down to the primer or even the plastic, don't panic. All you've got to do is just go back and paint that in with one of the other colors to represent a chip. So you really can't mess this technique up. Okay, I'm sure you probably could. I could. But if you just work slowly, you end up with a fairly realistic looking chipped effect because it's actual chipping. All right, well, I've still got a bit of work to do with that lighter colored chipping, and then I've got to get to the darker colored chipping too. And I want to keep these videos down to about 15 minutes, so I'm kind of running into that self-imposed deadline. So I'm going to call this a video, and in the next episode, I'll pick up with the darker chipping and then begin doing some other streaks and stains and things like that. So just carry on normally and see where we take this. But as always, thank you so much for being a patron. This is a Patreon exclusive video, so I hope you're enjoying this kind of deep dive into doing this, and it's a little different. I know it's taken more episodes, but I hope it's beneficial. If nothing else, I hope it's perhaps, you know, helped you get a nice nap. So with all that being said, I'll leave you with one final thought, as I always like to do. In this hobby, if you're not having fun, you're doing it wrong. Happy day to you, friends. Bye-bye.